Fronts, battling air. In this video, scientists will be able to predict weather by analyzing fronts. So what is a front? Well, as air masses move across Earth, they bump into each other. And a front is the boundary between those two air masses. There are both warm fronts and cold fronts. On a map, warm fronts are represented by these lines with semicircles on one side of the line, whereas a cold front will be a line with triangles on one side or another. I would highly recommend putting a note about warm fronts and cold fronts and how they're represented on maps. In a cold front, cold air rushes towards warm air and replaces it at the surface. You can see in the diagram that the cold air is pushing through the warm air. Because cold air is more dense, it will sink underneath the warm air. The warm air, because it is less dense, will float on top of the cool air. That forces the warm air up, and as the warm air is pushed up into the atmosphere, it starts to cool. Now, sometimes this will lead to thunderstorms and rain, and other times it won't. A warm front is kind of the opposite. In a warm front, warm air pushes into cold air. Warm air replaces the cold air at the surface. Now, because cold air is more dense, the warm air can't go under it. The warm air still floats on top of the cold air. So just like with a cold front, the warm air is forced up into the atmosphere. And as it goes up into the atmosphere, it'll start to cool. Again, this might lead to rain and thunderstorms, but sometimes it doesn't. The key thing here is that in a warm front, the warm air pushes the cold air. Now, when it comes to reading a weather map, which we're going to need to do in order to predict weather, we need to look at a few things. First, on the map, maybe you've seen these lines on the weather maps on the daily news. The line shows the boundary between two air masses. In this example, there's an air mass above the line, and there's an air mass below the line. These air masses are going to be different types of air masses. The symbols on the line tell you which type of front it is. And the symbols on the line also show you the direction it's moving. I like to think that the symbols point in the direction of the wind. So in this example, this front is moving sort of straight down. The air mass on top is going to be pushing down on the air mass underneath it. Here's an incredibly important piece of information. When it comes to rain and snow and weather, you have to remember that precipitation, or rain, snow, and sleet, falls from clouds. And clouds only form when there's rising water vapor. Remember that water vapor condenses into clouds. And in order to get clouds, you need moist air. Again, to form a cloud, you need water vapor. And what that means is that dry air cannot form clouds. Only moist air is able to form clouds. Which takes us to our key ideas. The first is that fronts form where two air masses meet. A cold front forms when cold air replaces warm air, or when the cold air pushes the warm air out of the way. And a warm front is when warm air replaces cold air. And finally, perhaps the most important fact is that precipitation only happens if there's water vapor in the air.